Stanley is a registered architect. This is fine print. It's going to take me a long time to go through this. He's made 20 visits to Bangladesh. He's traveled out of Illinois, his birth state, to Michigan, and fortunately enough to Indiana. He's been here before. He's taught here. He has charge accounts in some of the finest shops in Chicago. I know this because even though Stanley is a really big name in architecture, he shared some of this information with me. After being born in Chicago, Stanley received his architectural degree from Yale after some time. In '64, he began his own practice, which developed into all kinds of work which has been published internationally. He's been a visiting lecturer at many universities and currently is head of the graduate program in architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle. In 1976, he was on the Progressive Architecture Design Awards jury, and in 1977 was chairman of the AIA Institute Honors Jury. 1976, he was chairman of the AIA Committee on Design and was coordinator of an exhibition and catalog called Chicago Architects. He's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and is currently on the advisory committee for the School of Architecture at Yale. In 1976, he was one of 11 architects chosen to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale. He organized the Chicago 7 and has coordinated their shows. In '79, he was the Charlotte Shepard Davenport Professor of Architecture at Yale. In 1980, was appointed the Architect in Residence at the American Academy in Rome. He authored in 1980 the book Late Entries to the Chicago Tribune Competition and co-organized the same exhibition. And in 1980, he was one of 8 architects chosen to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale. Next year, Stanley will serve as the Elliott Professor of Architecture at Harvard University. It's really a pleasure for me to have Stanley back here again, and I hope he will spend some time with us in the future, even more than just this evening. Topic of his talk is the topic of his book, which is to be published this March by Rizzoli, called Post-modernism is a Jewish Movement, and I'm really delighted to introduce Stanley Tigerman tonight. All right. This is the point. Just keep. Are you sure? Does it work? Okay. I don't know. Have a seat, Mark. Thank you. I'll take this. I'll read this when I go sit down. It's so long. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be back here. It's even more of a pleasure to see Bob as the dean and Marvin as the chairman. I think that's great. Because I think this has always been a terrific school, but I think with these people, I've just, in the brief time I've been here this afternoon and tonight, I've already noticed this a nice upbeat spirit, and we're counting on you guys. What I want to do tonight is to do this in 3 parts. I want to read some things with the lights on, and I want the lights to go off, and I'll show some work trying to prove up the case bumblingly of what I want to talk about first.
and then I'll show some slides of drawings and read the rest of this. This is a sort of an excerpting of a part of the book that I've been working on for about a year and a half now, and is an attempt, albeit a controversial one, to talk to the subject of Platonic ideality and to look at America post-Vietnam. And it's a kind of controversial conclusion because it's a suggestion of a sort of Aristotelian dialectic, a dualism, so to speak. And I became interested in this because of the way of what's happened in America, which then structured, to my way of thinking, what some of you think of as postmodernism, but in all events is after the modern movement. So that's what I want to do, is to sort of read some of the background, a little bit of it, and then to show you how I've tried in my own way through my work, for better or worse, since 5 years ago, but progressively, I think, a little more clearly, to try and deal with the subject of dualism through the work itself. There's a couple of quotes that I think kind of structure it. There's a book by Mircea Eliade, who is the theologian and mystic in residence at the University of Chicago, called The Sacred and the Profane. In that book, he's quoted as saying, "It must be understood that the cosmicization of unknown territories is always a consecration. To organize a space is to repeat the paradigmatic work of the gods." There's another quote by Roy Wagner, the very distinguished anthropologist. In his book, The Invention of Culture, he says that anthropology is theorized and taught as an effort to rationalize contradiction, paradox, and dialectic. Silvano Arieti pointed out in his book, Creativity, that the coincidence of the rise of psychoanalysis and modern art coming together as they did in 1895, when Freud and Breuer published their book on hysteria, and Cézanne had the very first show in the world of modern art, caused a great shockwave in Europe. When Cézanne said that he was not reproducing nature, but that he was representing it, he was disregarding Hellenic aesthetics and allowing a certain subjectivity to enter into his work. The influence of Plato, who gave prominence to the rational over the irrational and to the universal over the particular, started to be reversed. This did not mean that the rational and the universal would no longer be considered by the modern artist, but that the irrational and the particular would forcibly increase their participation in the artistic conception. First of all, it meant relying much more on imagery and imagination than on perception and memory. In the second place, it meant allowing the uniqueness of the subjective experience, whether originated inside or outside, to be fully expressed. Thus, different levels of the human spirit could now be shown at the same time. Now, American architects during the 1960s and then in the 1970s, frustrated with modernism's unfulfilled utopian promises and bored with its minimal palette, turned toward the most obvious source in cultural history to borrow stylistic and symbolic fragments in an effort to enrich their work and reconnect themselves with their past. That source was rooted in classical Greco-Roman art and architecture, the Hellenic Christian tradition so often sought as an orderly source of inspiration in times of stress such as that produced during the late 1960s. However, that direction proved unsatisfactory and in some measure was replaced by attitudes found in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as in all revolutionary movements, and the rejection of modernism was just that, the first straw to be grasped, that of classicism, was simplistic. The late 1960s and its struggle with emerging egalitarianism in America on the one hand and Vietnam on the other seemed to suggest that the mundane, even the profane, were a part of existence. Robert Venturi's book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, was a passionate plea for an understanding of these issues, a plea that seemed to fall on deaf ears as that powerful tradition of detachment, for the moment at least, prevailed. Yet over 130 years ago, the embattled Danish philosopher Kierkegaard wrote that to exist as a human being means to exist ethically and to face perpetually new moral choices. Aesthetic man remains detached and static, but ethical man is in the process of becoming. He evolves as a personality which combines the universal with his subjective being and thus partakes of eternity. There now exists an uneasiness with that tradition which began literally 6 centuries before Christ, where speculative thought became secular. Man began to seek explanations which, before that time, were left within the secure realm of myth. It was the beginning of the effort to come to grips with our universe, that is, the inception of pure reason. The struggle that began with the questioning of the irrational or mythic, where everything was divided in the Hellenic mind into 2 parts, objectivity and universality on the one hand, and subjectivity and relativity on the other, suggests the outrageous possibility that just perhaps architecture can simultaneously represent those disparate purposes. The concept of 2 worlds, which Plato himself confronted, is at the source of this emerging consciousness, where one world is unseen and ephemeral, ideal in form, and having perpetual concepts of thought, presided over by God, all over and against a flawed, materialistic replica of such values, life itself. Plato's reconciliation of those opposites nonetheless took nothing away from the dichotomy that was central to Christian theology, which also had its origination in the Jewish dialectic. Between perception and conception, between the idea and the object, when synthesized and made divine by Plato, was also the fact of the split between Plato and his student Aristotle. When architecture and its divine measuring capability moved toward Platonic thought is when the sense of the perpetual and the ideal in Western architecture was codified. It was that codification which America sought in the early 1970s as a panacea in turbulent times. For the first time in history, the simplistic response to one approach by replacing it with its opposite was unfulfilling, as the complexities of a sophisticated yet essentially ruptured culture demanded a more comprehensive response than that available in pure Platonic thought. Whether Plato saw his 2 worlds, this and the next, stemming from reason, and whether Christianity saw those 2 worlds in the sense of revelation, architecture traditionally has been able to service both in its devotion to perpetual values judged by all of the ages. In The Sacred and the Profane, Mircea Eliade sees the relationship of opposites as anything but static when he refers to the door of a church as a juxtapositional symbol, when he says, "The threshold that separates also indicates the distance between 2 modes of being, the profane and the religious. The threshold is the limit, the boundary, the frontier that distinguishes and opposes 2 worlds, and at the same time the paradoxical place where those worlds communicate, where passage from the profane to the sacred world becomes possible." Traditionally, buildings were conceived of as representing not only their own time, but eternal civilization as well. This was accomplished platonically. Divine qualities were quantified by which buildings could be measured. 2 different attitudes about architecture, the formal and the rational, have prevailed historically, each philosophy tending to be replaced by its opposite when the former had exhausted the potential inherent in the technological and social symbols of the times. Thus, when neoclassical interests in Greco-Roman archaeological forms petered out after the Renaissance, then Mannerism, then Baroque, rational thought, so-called, once again prevailed, reinvigorating neo-Gothic interests in structural clarity. When that too became depleted because of its limited palette, decoration appeared through Victoriana and Art Nouveau. Through satiation, this too was replaced by the modernist architectural revolutions of the early 20th century, but this time it was paralleled by an international social revolution, with support systems rationalizing avant-garde polemics. I contend that architecture can express attitudes of formalism and rationalism simultaneously. In opposition, they actually reinforce each other. Traditional methods of synthesis show a preference for one side or the other. Therefore, there is always a winning side and a losing side. In contradistinction stands the notion to elaborate, embellish, and enrich each side alternatively. By presenting each side of the argument not only separately, but in incomplete fashion, a consciousness is forced upon the viewer such that participation in the physical dialectic is necessary to understand the result. There's a significant tradition in the study of contradictions, not in architecture, but that tradition is extant, but none is more fascinating in the context of translating dualistic thought into physical form than between Hellenic and Hebraic attitudes. According to the distinguished Norwegian theologian Thorleif Bowman, who is the man who was paraphrased extensively by Norris Kelly Smith in his book on Frank Lloyd Wright and architectural content. And according to Bowman, he said, if Israelite thinking is to be characterized, it's obvious first to call it dynamic, vigorous, passionate, and sometimes quite explosive in kind. Correspondingly, Greek thinking is static, peaceful, moderate, and harmonious in kind. The thinking of the Greeks is spatial, and that of the Hebrews is temporal. As black is best perceived in the presence of white, and as the sacred is best perceived in the presence of the profane, the contradistinct proposition that the thinking of the Greeks is spatial and that of the Hebrews is temporal is illuminating. The struggle to represent the difference between opposing points of view in visual form was a problem Hellenic artists faced in order to depict the encounter between man and God, wherein God makes his presence known to man. That phenomenon, which the Hebrews called kibbut and which the Greeks called doxa, took an awesome form, alien to Greek and Roman experience. It's clear that the dichotomy between the Hebrew idea that man is created in the image of God and the Hellenic concept that God is created in the image of man are concepts that in parallel have plagued representation throughout history. To create an image adequate to the full force and meaning of that kibbut doxa meant that the pictorial means of Greco-Roman art had to be deployed to Hebraic ends. A cultural divide had to be crossed. That cultural divide separated spatiality from temporality and was based on the two different interpretations of man's encounter with God, where for the Jews the encounter was awesome and stunning, for the Greeks it was protective, character building, and informative. Objectivity versus subjectivity represent the polar positions that continuously wage battle to see which can better represent a given culture at a given time. We have just come through a time where idealist objectivity gained the upper hand. Modernist preoccupations with ideality precluded involvement with the particular and specific in life, as anti-personality cultism was the manner of the time. The detachment common to those who intellectually dabbled in idealizing conventions extended well beyond the making of things alone. The great Palladian scholar Jim Ackerman at Harvard pointed out that Cubism, international style architecture, and their descendants in the 50s were the modern reinstatements of the classical tradition. Critical theory perfectly complemented the asceticism and purism of early 20th century art in enjoining the critic and historian from engaging with the art object. This is representative of the detached view of aesthetic man that Kierkegaard talks about. But Kierkegaard also says that to exist as a human being means to exist ethically and to face perpetually new moral choices. Built into that one sentence is the crux of the problem, not only with modernist polemics extended into physical form, but the entirety of perpetual architectural position-taking throughout all the ages that precludes one from dialectically positing more than one point of view at one time. Can I have the lights, please? Did they do it here? Oh. So what I want to do is to take, does the other one? Oh, okay. Is to take a whole bunch of projects, some of which are as far back as 75 and 76, like this project, the so-called hot dog house, that dealt with the subject of opposites. The idea, even then, of attempting to pursue things in opposition simultaneously. This, the case of a house that on the one side is opaque, the other side is transparent, the one side is a natural material, the other side is a Mondrian painting, both of which are played off against, on the one hand, nature done as a grid, on the other hand, nature in its most natural form. This project, the Daisy House, in 1976, on the one side is anthropomorphic, but is also materialized in the sense that it's made out of something. It's vertical boards, copings, downspouts, gutters. The other side is empty, is devoid of that, with as little detail as is possible as a stucco facade, as a face. And the idea of doing two sides in opposition, but then also made more complex by the architectural fact of life, in the sense that buildings are made of something on the one hand, and even when one wishes to dematerialize them, they ultimately cannot be. But the project that perhaps was the first thing, you'll see this over and over again, project that really put me out of this was based on a book that was written by Joseph Rickworth called On Adam's House in Paradise, where the idea of a 9-square piece as an overall piece, which is then ruptured down the middle, part of which is topiary, part of which is a building, one side looking at the other, the historical connection of perpetual homes and otherwise, and then the model, and then a project based on that, even now yet to be built, for the Baha'i faith, where this is the Baha'i temple in Wilmette, Lake Michigan, Sheridan Road, and then this object, which is the same thing off of one of the 9 axes of the Baha'i temple. So obviously I began to be interested and involved in the idea of the split piece, of a piece pulled apart and then left apart and not reassembled. But obviously, in a sense, it's reassembled visually, whether it's not done in fact. Similarly, with the Library for the Blind, where a building is a study in oppositions. On the one hand, a very dense material, a concrete wall, ruptured horizontally, albeit irrationally, because for me blindness was an irrationality. The other side, a very lightweight material, metal panels, but made opaque. So the heavy thing is made transparent, the other side is made opaque. But then metaphorically the same thing, doing exactly the sort of inversion of what one might expect a garage at a Library for the Blind would then be. This building, as Manfredo Tafuri suggests in his book, The American City, from the Civil War to the present, suggesting the deathly mask of silence of modernism in a certain way. This is a remodeling as a kind of mask. Venturi's decorated shed, the piece that's in front as a contextual symbolic piece with a functioning rational thing behind it, which is then built just literally that way, as a deathly mask of silence, as a facade by itself. Another project, much more contemporary now, is the Anti-Cruelty Society, just not quite finished in Chicago, but somewhat more interesting than the decorated shed, and the idea of doing things in opposition to each other simultaneously. Because the building originally, because this is the idea of building semiologically as a sign, as a billboard in a certain way, which every building is, whether or not you do it consciously as one or you don't do it, as it was unconsciously done in 1933 in the first phase of the building for the ASPCA in Chicago, and then in 1953 in its kind of laid-back, quasi-boring modern building, both of which can be thought of as institutional buildings. They both talk to the subject of architecture. They both deal with architectural problems, what Peter Eisenman calls intrinsic problems, problems of architectural note, as opposed to the extrinsic ones of communicative value beyond architecture itself. So when we, in 1977 or 8, I forget now, we were first asked to, I think 78, to work on this project, this society, which up to that time was obviously there as a kind of haunting, euthanizing, institutional facility, they were shifting their image into one of adoption. The plan and the building, the elevation on the left and the building on the right. So the idea here is the building is a message. Behind it is the actual, the same functions and organization, everything that's always been there, but their attempt now is to convey the idea of adoption, which we, in our own ways, tried to think of in terms of inducing residential referentiality. That is to say, a pediment, Palladian cutout, key to a can of dog food, basset hound's cheeks, living over the store, double hung windows, the old doggy in the window trick, where the doggies are there and you go by and you want to sort of adopt them. The idea of using horizontal lapped siding, out of aluminum to be sure, but wood grain to be equally sure. So, I mean, there it is, and we're just waiting for the old doggies in the window. But the idea of building as sign of communicating another sort of intention as the subject of, as certain subjects like euthanasia become something that one can begin to discuss, and where the idea of sentimentality is no longer such an embarrassment. So I make these little drawings that you'll see more of them. But then there's another project where this becomes closer to the truth in the sense of a kind of Janus piece. I mean, it's sort of an inversion. Some years ago, this is a kind of a mini map of the city of Chicago, a section of it with the lake, Lincoln Park, the outer drive, and in a building, a street called Montrose, it's here. And 10 years ago, I did a building called Boardwalk, which is a HUD project, a 28-story, high-rise, middle-income, 450 units, contextual, Chicago, grid, Mies, boring building. And then the same developer 10 years later assembled a big piece of ground over here and wanted to replicate the same tower. To sort of show he was doing a kind of private urban renewal, taking over the neighborhood, and then do townhouses and a big commercial mall and store and stuff and parking. A block away from that is the northern end of Graceland Cemetery. Now, buried in Graceland Cemetery, there and there are Mies van der Rohe and Louis Sullivan, which are then on axis with these two buildings. So it's an opportunity that, you know, you just can't pass up. So this was the first building, which is sort of the context then, from the developer's point of view, which was done 10 years ago, which is a kind of borrowing, which is just a euphemism for rip-off, of Mies's first building in Lafayette Park in Detroit, which is a 20-foot bay and a 10-foot module producing sort of an 8x8 opening, which is then golden sectionalized into 5x8, 3x5, 1.75x3, all in kind of Duranodic sash and solar bronze glass. It's in good taste. Right? So that's the basic building. This drawing was made by one of your own, Peter Haverlevich. You'll notice there's no lettering on it because he can't letter with it. Take a bow, Peter. This is the site plan and then the plaza plan, which is the sort of tower and townhouses and of the new building itself. Now, from the east, all that can be seen of the new tower is the superstructure, because all this stuff from this place onto the ground is hidden by another, you'll see in a later rendering, of 4 and 5 and 6 story buildings. So all you can see is the parallel tower, and indeed there's the shadow of the original tower in the background, which is the same superstructure of the 20-foot bay, the 10-foot module, golden sectionalized solar bronze glass. From that point on down, however, which only if you go to the building, you then see that there are townhouses which are just now under construction in Della Francesca colors with Palladian cutouts and shutters and lattices, railings, a kind of a narthex to real estate development, which is the entry with a rose windows grill, and then commercial at the base with sort of neo-rational grid and guild signs. So what it is it's the typologies of the city imprinted on the facade of a building. Commercial, entry, the little house, and the alienating grid of the tower. As you turn the corner from the other side, I mean, there is the original one on the lake, all that is turned into black glass with black anodized sash, with balconies as pilasters and ionic cutouts, and an entablature hiding the mechanical equipment. So it becomes a giant order superimposed on the facade of the building and on axes with Mies and Louis Sullivan in the cemetery. But in all events is a study in oppositions, and I made a couple drawings some 2 or 3 years ago when it was done, which was in a show at the Walker Art Center called The Linear City, Optimism and Skepticism of the Linear City, one of which was the optimism of the modern movement, the linear city of Algiers or Chicago, if you like, and the sort of dematerialized gridding of modernism facing the optimism of the future, and then the other side, the materialized facade of the tower, the church, the little house, the Chicago River, the River Styx, if you like, and the cemetery. This is another project dealing with that kind of opposition. This is a kind of massive remodeling that we just finished on a building, this poor thing, it was built in the 40s, which was actually, if we'd found it that way, would have kept quite a lot of it. But by the time we got there, the owner was a contractor. He'd already ripped off the top part, and we started to build a mansard roof, and then he hired us, and so we did a kind of layered piece based on the Villa Madama, not on the Villa Madama, the Villa Barbaro at Misère by Palladio, which is really, it's called a House of the Pompadour because he has one. It's a kind of a wavy hairdo. As a superimposition with a cutout, pedimental cutout, and the plan was a complete redo of the original building. And then on the other side, so there it is in axonometric, and the other side is the pediment solid, but then a cutout of his reclining nude wife, sort of as a siren facing the sea. So there you can see the cutout on the other side. So that on this side, and there's the other. So you can kind of tell that there's that and there's... Then another study in oppositions is towards kind of taking the modern movement Platonic solids and kind of superimposing them with anthropomorphic pieces. there's a company near Lago Maggiore in northern Italy that does teapots and coffee pots and stuff, and they have hired Venturi and Graves and Isozaki and Holine and others to do sort of their teapots and coffee pots. And my wife, Margaret McCurry, and I are doing these. So this is taking the platonic solid of a cylinder as a coffee pot with a handle, which is then bakelite, and you grab it by the handle. This is the sort of sugar thing, which is the only mildly erotic piece because you kind of lift it by the ears. And then this is called hot lips and cold lips, and it's for hot milk and cold milk, and you grab it by the hair and it pours out. And then there's a broken heart for salt and pepper, and napkin rings as an eye, and then a tray with hands as trivets that you grab the plastic hands with your hands. And this is a project, Haverley, which did this drawing too, also without lettering. This is a project called The Great American Cemetery, which we did with the trompe-l'oeil artist Richard Haas, which is in the Collaboration Show in New York, which is a study in sort of the use of the American suburban house as the headstone or sarcophagus, rather continuing to import first century Roman and other European icons suggesting perpetuity and culture continue to come from Europe. But in fact, typologically, these forms, the American suburban houses, have been around sufficiently long to be legitimate to be seen in a rather more perpetual way. But another aspect of the double piece, like the Little House in the Clouds, is the idea of split symmetry, of a building that is pulled apart and then left apart. This is a villa that is a project which is then pulled apart, much like the Villa Madama by Raphael and Giulio Romano, or the Villa Giulia by Vignola, where pieces are seen incomplete, but in all events fall into the background as poche, where the person becomes the centermost character on stage, not the building, as opposed to modernism, where the building became the central figure. The intention here is to push the building back into the background, and it's a 19th century humanist attitude about the person being the predominant figure. Another case, which is getting a little closer now to what I wish to talk to, is a house that's under construction right now in Kings Point, Long Island, which is a kind of Lutyens-esque building, which what you see is not what you get, where the primary axis of symmetry is not the entry, but entry is in fact the rupturing of the building as it then telescopes out from two-story to one-story to little bay window. So the axis of symmetry is the sheared part, and that individual rooms, while entered almost in a propylaea-like way on the diagonal, once in the space, are locally symmetrical. So every room is entered on the diagonal, but once in the space is then locally symmetrical. The other rather larger scale intention is the rupturing of the building, which is the circulation system, separating the profane, the parking and all that, from the lawn and Manhasset Bay down here. So the idea of things not being what they are and being ruptured or skewed continues to show up. And that's, as I say, under construction. Another case of a kind of almost Palladio's Villa Emo at Fanzolo, in a seismic shift of a building sort of angularly disposed, which has a belvedere that you drive into a parking garage below, and then there's a belvedere with an axis of symmetry, but you enter up the other way, and what you see is sort of the face at Beaumarchais at the end. It was a project that I did last year when I was in Rome. But this gets a lot closer to the point. This and the several projects from here on to the end really show it, I think, more clearly. This is a house now that's under construction now in a place west of Chicago called Barrington Hills, where it's two separate things, where there is a facade, much like that other villa, obviously still based on the Villa Madame or the Villa Giulia, but that's in contradistinction to a building as a metaphor of a village, which is then disposed behind it. And even at that point, it's a series of 16-foot gable roofs, but is an incomplete form, so that you, through the ideal form, through the classical form, you penetrate through to the vernacular, so to speak, literally as an entrance through a drive-in courtyard, through a segretti, a secret garden, which is really for the daughter and an au pair, or for the sort of maternal wing. And that each of those structures is then in turn sacred, and the profane of function is then much in the way that Le Corbusier used those two things juxtaposed against each other, is always there, but the structure always comes through, whether it's in beams or lintels or whatever it is. But at the larger scale, two very different orders are at work. One is as the morphological, vernacular, romantic notion of the village, almost ad hoc, and the other is that classical form that we all know so well, but now thrust into the background as in the earlier villa, but in this case made very, very thin indeed. So that axonometrically it's on a beautiful piece of land in a forest that you drive through, and then this facciata is there at that point, which you then penetrate and go through, and behind is simply what appears to be as an expedient village of a series of gable roof buildings going on through. From the other side, it's the same thing, only with some sort of giant moldings as some functional elements, bathrooms and greenhouses and things. But there again, you see the village on the other side with the facade, which is the entry. So it's the idea of things in juxtaposition without taking the liberty of synthesizing it, but leaving that as a necessity for the observer, for the viewer, for something to fulfill and complete. A project that really comes very much closer for me is 2 years ago, I did a competition, a sort of charrette that Miami of Ohio, Rich McCormick, who's now at the ACSA, put together when he was then yet there, where he brought Bob Stern, Michael Graves, and myself to Pleasant Hill, Kentucky, and a number of students which we worked as a design group, to do a project for a long since deceased, the cult community called Shakertown, for the Shaker community in Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. Now, I don't know how much you know about the Shakers, but you probably have seen those fabulous books with their beautiful Shaker rockers and furniture and their buildings, which are split symmetrical pieces with 2 stairs. Everything is doubled, and so the central part is left open for the person, which is based on the abstinence connected with the cult of the religion itself. So that, I mean, obviously, once you took the vows, the men went over there, the women went over there, into sort of dormitory situations, but yet they went up into sort of nightshirts no more than 10 feet away from each other on these symmetrical stairs. So there's a titillating thing involved at the same time. And they always put flour on the floor at night to make sure guys didn't go across. And guys were always being kicked out because there were footprints. So what they wanted to do was to do a kind of visitor center. And what this particular Shaker community was, the Ohio River is somewhere here, is that they would ply their wares after the Civil War and talk people into joining the community, which had 3 parts, there, and there, but all on the north side above this road, which was sort of thought of as the Shaker world, where they lived in those buildings, 1, 2, 3, that had their cottage industries, the making of all their beautiful, if sparse, crafts behind them. And the only things on the other side of the road, so if you came in, for example, and joined it, you lived in this sort of novice thing, and if you then and worked in these buildings, and then if you took the vows, you then were separated from your wife and all of that in these buildings, and the elders, the sages, lived there. The only thing that happened on the other side of the road was the meeting house where they bartered and traded with society and held their sort of Saturday night equally titillating dances where the public could see. But And they were also buried on that side, on the world side of the road. So they sort of came from the world, they went through their life on the other side of the Shaker world, and they ended up on this side. Now all those buildings that they lived in had detail, were materialized. And by that I mean measurable, like these buildings in brick, where you can count the bricks, and you know that they're 2 1/4 by 3 3/4 by 8, and so you can tell the heights of buildings and all of that. So they had shutters and downspouts and gutters, and they had a sense of materiality. So what we did was to kind of represent or rethink out the poignancy connected with that familial separation, was to take a simple gable roof building, much of life. So I only show these plans as a kind of indication of what it was that we were doing. In other words, half the building is there and the other half of the very same building is on the other side of the road, 1/4 mile away. But even then, while it was sheared, there was the visual desire to pull the buildings back together, to make it a platonic whole, because that's a part of our desire at the same time. Another project, which gets even closer, was a 6th place we took in an international competition for corporate headquarters outside of Cologne last year that Peter also worked on, which is a corporate headquarters for a German company that made sort of locks and secret German things. And they had this sort of factory existing, and what we did is to create an axis of symmetry, much like the Little House in the Clouds, and flip it on the other side in a kind of Schinkel-esque forest, creating this new axis, which happened to be directly east-west, with the Autobahn there and a ring road there, so that the factory and the guys, the Volkswagens would come in there, and the Mercedes, Marvin Rosen, and those guys come in there. And then, and this new axis of symmetry actually split the building programmatically, as it was in fact, where on one side, this is the typical floor plan, the people who faced the world, the people in the 3-piece polyester double-knit suits, the sales guys were over here, and they looked across the part that was ruptured to all these guys in white smocks making these secret German things. And so then they could go across through a lock, which is sort of a metaphor, because the company made, among other things, locks. They had to call the elevator to go across on the same floor. But then the building was in turn much like Tafuri's mask. It was masking the typology of the corporate world, which of the sensuousness beyond, which was a tripartite building, the base, the shaft, and the tower, which was actually a pair of secret gardens up above. But the idea of a building, even without the classical column, top, middle, and bottom, as you'll see, nonetheless being thought of as a platonic solid, a cube, but then ruptured into 2 pieces, still reinforces the idea of the cube, of the desire to pull it back together. But when ruptured, semiotically and physically, on axis with the entry, where the sign was even ruptured, is the sign of the building, which in fact is the elevators going up and down kinesthetically at that point. But still, is it not a cube? One thinks of the most poignant of the Muse buildings, 860 and 880 Lakeshore Drive, 900, 910, buildings that are incomplete, 2 buildings in juxtaposition to each other, which leaves the unfilled void, which deals then with your capability of viewing that thing. So in model form, that then is the cube, ruptured along the entry is there, so that everything is literally ruptured, including the sign of the building, and these water bodies, which again are on top of the building, and then the entry, which of course is the point of rupture. So is it 2 buildings or is it 1? The idea of a platonic solid ruptured into 2 pieces. That's made yet more clear in the final project I'm going to show, after which I'm going to show a bunch of drawings and read the rest of this. This is a project which is interesting. Last week I was going to Detroit and I saw both in Time and Newsweek that in fact it's come to reality. In 1937, Pablo Picasso painted an extraordinary painting, perhaps the most major painting of the 20th century, called Guernica, which was based on what happened in the Basque town in 1936 of the same name. This is a photograph immediately after what happened in 1936, where in the northern part of Spain, which is still separationist from Falangist Madrid, are cities, you've heard of Pamplona, where people like Hemingway ran before the Bulls, and San Sebastiano and Vitoria and Bilbao and Guernica. The German Air Force in 1936 was stationed somewhere here in a town called Vitoria on a plateau. And Guernica, which was sort of the entire region was very antagonistic to Franco, and many of the rebels were there. The sea is somewhere over here. And the German bombers took off one day in practicing, we called it El Ensayo del Espanto. In practice, which means the rehearsal for the horror of horrors, they took off and presumably to attack a guerrilla force which was somewhere here about 5 miles away. And they saw, overflying the town, it had just coincidentally happened to be during one of the fairs once a month that they held for animals and bartering and trading, that all the people of the town were mustered in. And they overflew the town, went to the sea, came back, and bombed the city systematically, and Stuka dive bombed it along precisely this line, that axis. The only buildings that remained was that school, this church, these 3 large houses, a place called the Casa de Juntas, which is the historical building of the Basque country, and what was then called, in hindsight, the Tree of Guernica. Picasso, of course, was deeply offended and did this incredible painting, which I'm sure a number of you have seen at the Museum of Modern Art, which was at the Museum of Modern Art for years and years and years. And it depicted he was depicting, on the one hand, extrinsically and symbolically man's inhumanity to man. On the other hand, he depicted that by way of post-Cubist devices, if you remember the painting. So it was not just about bulls and steers and children and people being blown up, but the method by which that was communicated, which was in support of it, the intrinsic artistic method of post-Cubist devices was used. Well, in November, my wife and I went to Spain because I had been asked to give some lectures, 3 lectures actually, in the Basque country. And while we were there, they took us to Guernica, and I was asked to enter a closed competition, which is an incredible program, for a symbolic museum to house a painting that will never go there, the Guernica. Now, the Guernica, in fact, last week, which we all knew even at the time, last November, and has been known for some years, as per Picasso's desire and his will, was finally shifted to the Prado, which is interesting all by itself because Picasso, knowing it was Falangist Spain and pro-Franco, which it still is, even after his death, nonetheless left his painting to the Prado. But the Basques, of course, hoping that the painting, but knowing it never would, held this competition as sort of a symbol, which we got an honorable mention in, which is a competition that was very poignant for me because it not only deals most contemporaneously with the attitude that I'm bumblingly trying to convey about attempting to do things simultaneously, but also because the Guernica was the first thing when I was a very young boy that I saw that meant art in a sense to me. And when I went to Guernica last November, I was very touched to actually go there. We actually went up onto that plaza, which is there, which is about 5 meters above the park, which has since been divided by a street, and met a lot of old people who would predictably sit out on plazas and look at things and whatever. And through translation, I don't speak Spanish, our guides and friends and architects from the Basque country translated, and they all pointed where the bombers had come from, and it was quite touching. So what we did, this is a site plan, this is our solution to it. We did a kind of sacred plaza and a profane park. And in the sacred plaza is a Cartesian grid, which is really a skylight to an underground museum that you go down and through and has within it the negative of the Guernica in black on black, with the negative sketches in black on black against the wall on this side of the Cartesian grid skyline. We then took 5 platonic solids. I don't remember which order, but you'll see in an axionometric of a sphere, a cube, a cylinder, a cone, and half a cube octahedron, a pyramid, out of blood red granite, and then ruptured them vertically, thereby revealing their geology, if you will, sort of rupturing forever the way in which Platonism had been seen since that point. This is another photograph from that time in 1936, and this is the plan, an elevation from the Sacred Plaza, and then from the profane park below. And then finally, an axonometric of the 5 pieces ruptured, with a series of sections going through, cut through each of those 5 places, so that as you look skyward, because of the directionality, the painting being along this wall, and you're walking through here somehow, underneath it, so that you're always, by virtue of the directionality, reminded of the direction of the bombers, and then hovering above you, half a sphere or cone or cube octahedron or cylinder or whatever, as a reminder of what it was that meant at that time. Another project that's more recent is a project that we did for Thonet, where a number of us were asked to do exhibits, and again, it's the little house in the clouds. It's the Thonet. It's bent wood in that simplistic sense, coming from the tree, but in the end, it's the split piece with nothing in the middle, whether it's a yellow brick road leading to nowhere with surrealism on the wall beyond or not. The 2 pieces, the split symmetry, the pieces pulled apart and left apart with no further intention of putting them back together. So what I'd like to do is to read the rest of this and then show a series of slides of drawings of mine. Platonic theory holds forth the conception of perfection, what architects refer to as the spirit of all the ages. A part of man's aspiration deals with the leaving of his footprint such that later others may know that he was here. At the same time, that perpetual concept suggests that life on Earth is less than ideal. Most historically legitimate architectural monuments are concerned with ideality. But were they not also a representation of the times when they came into existence? Dualistic attitudes represented by both the finite and the infinite bring to mind a Kierkegaardian riddle. He who lives ethically has memory of his life, whereas he who lives aesthetically has not. Only those who are seeking moral ideals are thus existing. Morality enters into any discussion concerning Platonic attitudes when totemistic, holistic, iconic, and ideal concerns are presented as outweighing the simple representation of life itself, however flawed. Curiously, America, vintage 1960 to 1980, is less ideal and more biblical in its attempt to consciously contend with its own irony, frailty, schizophrenia, life and death, in a word, humanity. Modern life continues to demand multiple roles to be played, such that the concern of idealism versus realism is a contemporary tug of war every bit as much as the traditional battle between the classical and the vernacular. In Judaism, one is taught that he is a saint by being a martyr. Ethics are not taught in terms of ideality or the goal as the end point. Talmudic reasoning does not suggest synthesis. Rather, it is based on one being torn this way and that, and the implications of each. The Torah is thought to be at once hidden and manifest, esoteric and exoteric. Architecturally, by concentrating on this world and not the next, the concept of the imperfect form of building represents the imperfect anthropomorphic condition. Judaism suggests that the basic morality question is not an established symbol, but rather a constant personal argument. The tensions the Talmud preserves, views in conflict, argument advancing and withdrawing, contradictions harmonized only with acutest dialectic, diverse subjects made to reveal underlying principles, the movement of the mind from theme to theme, and the succession of generations of scholars seeking for the new developments and insights sanctioned by the old. Even Nietzsche reinforces these tensions by saying, "I believe only by doubting whether I believe." Architecturally, it is possible to visually represent the idea of argumentation between pure Platonic solids as a source of inspiration within the tradition of history in juxtaposition to the perverse desire to rupture that sense of perfection, to better represent frailty and the human condition, all by way of explaining the overtly disparate forces that man continuously faces. Inversion and reversal can be related to Ecclesiastes, who states in the Bible that there is a time for everything. Fashion and change are not the repugnant subjects that architects accuse them of being. They simply often stand in the way of a zeitgeist mentality that wishes things to exist in a certain way, whether or not that is the fact of the matter. Fashion and change are nothing more than the way civilization expresses itself within its own times. On the other hand, the ideality that is normally at the root of architects' concerns as they go about the business of attempting to replicate Eliade's paradigmatic godliness is constantly present. The struggle between these polarities is what life is about. Architecture is also about that very same struggle. The question of death as endpoint seems to suggest that the subject of irony is nothing more than an inevitability. Architecturally, irony is not in and of itself evil, and may be employed to express the notion of simultaneity over and against the concept of synthesis. Now, synthesis can be argued to be an attempt at godliness, but in the Bible, Isaiah states, "My thoughts are not like your thoughts, nor are your ways like my ways, says the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." With respect to the iconic interpretation of the making of an architecture that has within it images conveniently communicating values based on perpetual concerns over and against the responsibilities of continuous judgments about life, is best seen in the light of that part of Exodus wherein God states, "You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself any idols in the shape of anything that is in the heavens above, or that is on the earth below, or that is in the water under the earth." When architecture is used in the service of perpetual values alone, it avoids representing the sanctification of life itself. As Kierkegaard celebrated ethical man in the process of becoming, so it is that man's work needs to be engaged in the process of becoming. In Jewish doctrine, life on earth counts too, and what I as an individual do has an eternal effect not only on my soul, but on earth as well. Thus, the human being must strive to sanctify life. Clearly, dualism has both great power and constant reinterpretation as its guideposts, and if, as Mies van der Rohe once said, that architecture is the will of an epoch translated into space, then in a time and place where civilization expresses its dualistic tendencies, certainly architecture is among the several disciplines responsible for interpreting those concerns into form. And I want to close with a quote from Silvano Arieti's Abraham the Contemporary Mind, where he says, "At dusk, when the earth seems to quiver The swallows joyfully circle the air, and in the velvet sky there is an expectation of the first stars. The trees, the bushes, and the grass, thirsty for dew, welcome the arriving night with their fragrances. Once at such an hour, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, between spring and summer, in an obscure part of the Near Orient, a 48-year-old man from the land of Ur feels as if he is being penetrated by the glory of all that he can see, hear, smell, and touch, and by the rest of the universe that he can think of and imagine. Like his contemporaries, this man from Ur feels possessed by that which surrounds him, as if not only the birds and the bushes, but the setting sun and the rising stars and the waves of the sea breaking on the rocky shores and the brook of the valley and the soft wind are all animated by some kind of inner life. But then suddenly, and yet calmly, in recognition of something that has been growing inside him for a long time, he feels he must for a few moments at least silence all earthly sounds, close his eyes to the glory of all celestial and terrestrial colors, and close his mind to the unseen spaces and the unlived times. And as he does so, his ephemeral grasp touches the eternal. With his inner ear, he can hear the eternal voice. The invisible appears to him in an invisible way, and the unthinkable become part of his thoughts. Even all the echoes of the human songs of sorrow and joy fade away and are replaced by a hymn, audible only to him, which sings of a greater harmony, a greater beauty, a greater justice, and of love. This is the revelation granted to Abraham, son of Terah, a revelation in its promised embrace bigger than the cosmos, permitting him, as it does, the intuition of something greater than the physical universe he knows, an essence separable from the world and yet eternally involved with it in a continuing state of care and love. Thank you very much.
Quite a change of mood now for me to talk. And so we would invite anybody who has a question to join us at the reception at Butterfields. We thank you all for coming. And I think yesterday was Stanley's birthday, and I'm pleased to see that even at the age of 51, he's still able to think, and his mind's still working, and it's comforting for me to see that. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. That's really excellent. You did that? That's pretty good. You're more than a month.